Once a poor boy revealed to a millionaire his daughter could walk, but his fiancée was stopping her. The truth changed their lives forever. A story of courage and justice that will touch your heart. Subscribe, leave your like, and comment where you are watching from. Chapter 1. The Cry That Echoed in Silence. The central air conditioning kept the perfect 22 degrees in Richard Anderson's office on the 35th floor of the most imposing commercial building in Manhattan. The panoramic windows offered a privileged view of the city that never sleeps, where the mirrored buildings reflected the afternoon sun, like diamonds embedded in concrete. Richard adjusted his designer glasses and turned his attention to the spreadsheet glowing on his state-of-the-art computer screen. Numbers. Always the numbers. They never lied, never disappointed, never abandoned him like people had throughout his life. At 42, Richard had built a financial empire from nothing. His consulting firm moved millions of dollars monthly, and his reputation as a man who turned failing businesses into profit machines was known throughout the country. He wore impeccably tailored suits that cost more than the annual salary of many Americans, drove an armored BMW imported from Germany, and lived in a penthouse in the Upper East Side that had graced the cover of architecture magazines. But behind the facade of success, Richard carried invisible scars. An orphan since the age of 7, he had grown up in public institutions, where he learned that trusting people was synonymous with suffering. Each rejection, each broken promise, each night crying alone in the dormitory had shaped the meticulous and controlling man he had become. He organized his life like an Excel spreadsheet. Every appointment had an exact time, every relationship followed specific protocols, every emotion was carefully categorized and filed. The intercom on his desk emitted a discreet beep. "Mr. Anderson," said the controlled voice of Mary, his secretary for 15 years, "there's someone here who insists on speaking with you. A boy." Richard frowned. No one passed through the building's security without prior authorization, let alone a child. He was about to ask Mary to handle the situation when the solid mahogany door was swung open with surprising force. A skinny boy, about 12 years old, burst into the room like an uncontrolled hurricane. "Mr. Richard, Mr. Richard," the boy shouted between sobs, his simple clothes brutally contrasting with the sophistication of the office. Worn sneakers, faded jeans, a t-shirt with holes in the sleeves. It was as if a piece of the outskirts of New York had materialized in the heart of the financial center. Richard stood up abruptly, knocking over the Mont Blanc pen that cost more than $3,000. He immediately recognized the boy, Peter, son of Mary, the janitor of the building where he lived. 3 years ago, on a rainy winter night, Richard had found mother and son sleeping under the awning of the building. Mary had lost her job and had been unable to pay for a room in a boarding house in the East Side for 2 weeks. Without explaining the reasons, not even to himself, Richard had offered the woman a job and helped her find decent housing. "Peter, how did you get here?" Richard approached the boy, noticing how his small hands trembled uncontrollably. "Mr. Richard, you need to listen. It's about Isabella, your daughter." The words tumbled out, mixed with tears and mucus. She can walk, I saw, but Miss Patricia won't let her." The name Patricia made Richard feel a strange warmth in his chest. Dr. Patricia Collins was everything he had always dreamed of finding. A beautiful, intelligent woman, a physical therapy graduate from NYU, daughter of a traditional family of New York doctors. When they met at a charity event 2 years ago, she had shown understanding of Isabella's situation, his 8-year-old daughter, who was born with a rare spinal cord injury that prevented her from walking. "Peter, you're confused," Richard said, trying to keep his voice calm despite his racing heart. "Isabella has a serious medical condition. She can't walk, son." "No, Mr. Richard, you don't understand." The boy clutched the sleeve of Richard's Italian suit with dirt-stained fingers. Yesterday at the summer festival in the building, when everyone was dancing, I saw her. Isabella got up from the chair to grab a chocolate truffle that fell on the floor. She walked 3 steps. Richard felt his legs weaken. The summer festival had been organized by Patricia, who insisted on having a special celebration to integrate the families in the building. He vaguely remembered seeing Isabella sitting in her pink wheelchair, watching the other children play. Patricia had explained that it would be very risky to try any type of motor stimulation outside the controlled environment of physical therapy sessions. "Peter, sometimes children make involuntary movements," Richard tried to explain, but his voice sounded less convincing than he would have liked. "It doesn't mean she can actually walk." "Mr. Richard, please!" The desperation on the boy's face was heartbreaking. When Ms. Patricia heard her steps approaching, Isabella really ran, back to the chair, and then she pretended she didn't know anything. But I saw the fear in her eyes. The office seemed to shrink, becoming more suffocating. The air conditioning continued to work perfectly, but Richard found it hard to breathe. Fragmented memories began to form in his mind. Isabella always avoiding eye contact when Patricia was present, her prolonged silences during meals, the way her legs involuntarily contracted during physical therapy sessions. "Mr. Richard," Peter continued, wiping his nose on the sleeve of his t-shirt, "my mum always said that when we see a child suffering, we have to speak up, even if no one believes us. Isabella is suffering, I know she is." As other children ran and played, she would cry in secret. Richard stepped away from the window and walked to his leather chair, feeling the weight of 2 decades of financial success crashing down on his shoulders. His entire life had been built on control, on the ability to analyze situations and make decisions based on concrete data. But there was a 12-year-old boy, the son of his cleaner, telling him that everything he believed about his own daughter could be a lie. Peter's words echoed in the silence of the office like alarm bells he had refused to hear. Richard thought of Patricia, her warm smiles, her always detailed and convincing medical explanations, how she had become indispensable not just as a fiancée, but as the only person who really understood Isabella's special needs. "Peter," Richard finally said, his voice hoarse and laden with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. "Tell me everything. From the beginning. Every detail you remember." The boy approached the mahogany table, his eyes shining with a mix of relief and determination. Outside, New York continued its frantic pace, oblivious to the fact that, in this air-conditioned office, the first cracks were appearing in the perfectly organized life of one of the city's most powerful men. Chapter 2. The Pieces of a Cruel Puzzle. Richard gestured for Peter to sit in the visitor's chair, but the boy remained standing, waving his hands as he organized his thoughts. The businessman activated the intercom and asked Marcia to cancel all his afternoon appointments, ignoring the surprise in her voice. In 15 years of working together, she had never seen him alter his schedule for personal reasons. "It started about 3 months ago, Mr. Richard," Peter began, running his hand through his messy hair. "My mom always arrives early to clean the building at 6 in the morning. I go with her during school holidays because there's nowhere else for me to go. Miss Patricia said I could stay in the game room while she did physical therapy with Isabella." Richard nodded, vaguely remembering the mornings when he would leave for work and find Peter in the elevator, always polite, always greeting him with a respectful "good morning." Patricia had suggested that the boy could be useful as company for Isabella, since she spent many hours alone during her rehabilitation exercises. "At first, I thought it was normal," Peter continued, nervously pacing the office. "Isabella would be in her wheelchair, and Miss Patricia explained that her leg muscles didn't work. But then I started noticing strange things. What kind of things? Richard leaned forward, his fingers drumming on the mahogany table with an anxious rhythm that contrasted with his usual composure. First, it was the medicine. Ms. Patricia would give Isabella a syrup every morning before physical therapy. She said it was a vitamin, but Isabella always made a face, like it was bitter. And after taking it, she would be kind of slow. You know when you're sleepy and can't think straight? A chill ran down Richard's spine. He remembered Patricia mentioning special supplements to strengthen Isabella's immune system. Something about children with disabilities needing extra care with their health. As a doctor, she had always been able to explain each procedure with technical terminology that sounded absolutely convincing. And there was something else, Peter continued, stopping in front of the shelf filled with business and economics books. When Miss Patricia would leave the room to answer the phone or get something from the kitchen, Isabella would completely change. It was like she woke up from a bad dream. What do you mean, change? Richard felt his throat dry. She would move her feet, Mr. Richard. She would flex her toes, bend her knees. Once I even saw her stretch her legs and touch her feet to the ground, like she was testing if she could feel anything. Peter's eyes sparkled with the memory. But whenever she heard Miss Patricia's footsteps coming back, she would quickly shrink back into her chair and freeze. Richard abruptly stood up and walked to the panoramic window, watching the incessant movement of the city below. New York buzzed with its 10 million inhabitants, each fighting for survival, dreams, opportunities. But there, in that moment, all his attention was focused on the words of a boy who might be revealing the most disturbing truth of his life. There's more, Mr. Richard. Peter's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. Last week, when that heavy storm hit on Thursday, remember, Ms. Patricia had to run out because they said her car had a window open in the parking lot. Richard turned, facing the determined gaze of the boy. And then? Isabella thought I had gone with her. I was in the bathroom when she left. When I came back to the room, I found Isabella standing in front of the big mirror in the therapy room. Peter paused dramatically, as if he were still processing the scene he had witnessed. She was walking, Mr. Richard. Slowly, a bit wobbly, but walking, and she was crying. The silence that followed was deafening. The buzz of the city below, the low hum of the air conditioning, even the ticking of the Rolex on Richard's wrist seemed amplified. The businessman felt as if the ground was disintegrating beneath his feet. When she saw me, she panicked, Peter continued, his voice heavy with a sadness that shouldn't exist in a 12-year-old. She ran back to the chair and started begging me not to tell anyone. She said if Ms. Patricia found out, bad things would happen. What kind of bad things? Richard asked, although part of him feared the answer. She didn't want to explain much. She just said that Ms. Patricia had told her that if she tried to walk, she could injure other muscles and make things worse. She could even die if she forced her legs. Peter shook his head in indignation. But I know when a child is truly scared, Mr. Anderson. Isabella wasn't afraid of getting hurt. She was afraid of Dr. Patricia. Richard returned to his armchair, but couldn't sit down. Instead, he leaned his hands on the table and leaned forward, trying to process the implications of what he was hearing. If Peter was right, it meant that Patricia was not just incompetent as a physical therapist. She was deliberately sabotaging his daughter's recovery. Peter, are you absolutely sure about what you're telling me? Richard asked, his voice coming out deeper than usual. Because what you're suggesting is very serious. Mr. Anderson, I swear on my late grandmother's soul, the boy replied, placing his hand on his chest solemnly. I know you might not believe me because I'm poor, and Dr. Patricia is a doctor and wealthy, but I don't lie about children suffering. My mother taught me that it's a sin. The mention of social disparity hit Richard like a punch in the stomach. How many times had he himself been discredited in childhood simply for being an orphan, for not having family, for lacking social status? How many truths had he shouted that fell on deaf ears because they came from the mouth of a worthless child? "Mr. Anderson?" Peter leaned closer to the table, his big dark eyes overflowing. With sincerity, "Isabella is a very smart girl. She knows something is wrong, but she doesn't understand what. And she's afraid to speak because Dr. Patricia always says you would be very sad if you knew she was pretending to be better." "Pretending to be better?" Richard repeated, feeling a growing nausea. "Yes. Dr. Patricia tells Isabella that you have suffered a lot in life taking care of her, and that if she gives you false hope, you might get sick from heartbreak. So Isabella prefers to stay in the chair so she doesn't disappoint you." Richard sat heavily in his armchair, the leather making a muffled sound under his weight. The manipulation was so subtle, so psychologically elaborate, that it bordered on cruel genius. Patricia had created an emotional prison where both he and Isabella were held captive by distorted love and manufactured guilt. The desk phone began to ring, but Richard completely ignored it. For the first time in 2 decades, business could wait. His daughter, and the terrible possibility that she was being held captive in her own home, was the only thing that mattered at that moment. Continue 0107. Chapter 3. Memories that reveal. The truth. The phone continued to ring insistently until Richard, in a burst of irritation, simply unplugged it. Silence returned to the office, but his mind was far from at peace. Peter stood, watching the businessman's reactions closely, as if he could decipher his thoughts through his facial expressions. "Peter, I need you to tell me more about the summer festival in detail," Richard said, adjusting his glasses nervously. "Every moment you remember." The boy nodded and moved closer to the visitor's chair, finally sitting on the edge of the expensive upholstery. "The festival started at 7 in the evening, in the building's hall. The building manager had decorated everything with colourful banners and balloons, and there were those food stalls that Mrs. Maria from apartment 302 insisted on organising." Richard remembered Patricia's excitement about the event. She had insisted they attend, saying it would be important for Isabella to feel included in the community. At the time, he had interpreted that as genuine care and concern for his daughter's social well-being. Isabella was in her pink chair, wearing that blue summer dress that Dr. Patricia bought especially for the festival, Peter continued, his eyes lighting up with the memory. "She looked happy watching the other kids running and playing, but at the same time she had that expression, as if she were watching a movie instead of participating in her own life." "And did you specifically watch her?" Richard asked. "Not at first. I was trying to toss rings onto a bottle to win a prize, but then there was that commotion with the children's dance." Peter paused, organizing his memories. Mrs. Carmen, who lives in 1201, was organizing the kids' dance. She called everyone, including Isabella, but Dr. Patricia quickly intervened, saying it would be too dangerous, Richard, who vaguely remembered the scene. Patricia had explained that the wheelchair could interfere with the choreography, and that it would be embarrassing for Isabella to be the only child who couldn't participate fully. Her solution had been to position Isabella at a strategic table, where she could watch and enjoy, observing the others. "That's when I started to really pay attention to her," Peter continued, "because Isabella's face changed when Dr. Patricia said she couldn't dance. It wasn't a normal sad face, you know. It was a face of anger, as if she knew she could participate but was being prevented." "And what happened with the chocolate truffle?" Richard pressed, feeling that detail was crucial. "Oh, that was after the dance. Everyone was eating at the stalls, and Dr. Patricia went to get some corn pudding for you two. She always made a point of personally choosing Isabella's food, right? She said it had to be special things because of her condition." Richard nodded. Another detail that at the time seemed like medical care, but now took on sinister contours. Patricia always meticulously controlled Isabella's diet, justifying that certain vitamins and minerals were essential for children with neurological issues. Isabella was fiddling with her plate when a chocolate truffle rolled off the table and fell to the floor. Peter continued, gesturing to emphasize the moment. She looked around, saw that no one was paying attention, and oh, Mr. Richard, I swear I saw with my own eyes that the earth is going to eat. She got up from the chair as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Richard's heart raced. Slowly, with difficulty. No! It was quick, natural, like any child would do. She took 3 firm steps, bent down, grabbed the chocolate truffle, and when she was returning to the chair, she heard the click of Dr. Patricia's heels on the floor of the living room. Peter's eyes filled with indignation. You should have seen the look of despair on her face, Mr. Richard. She practically threw herself into the chair and pretended to be fiddling with Dr. Patricia's phone, which had been left on the table. And Patricia didn't suspect anything. On the contrary, when she arrived, Isabella was there, quiet, and even cleaned the chocolate truffle before eating it so she wouldn't stain her dress. Dr. Patricia even praised her for being such a well-behaved and careful girl. Richard stood up again and walked to the window, watching the tiny cars moving on the streets below like organized ants. His mind was processing not only what Peter was saying, but all the little inconsistencies he had ignored over the months. Peter, you said Isabella was fiddling with Patricia's phone. Yeah, and that reminded me of something else strange. The boy perked up, as if he had remembered an important piece of the puzzle. Dr. Patricia gets a lot of calls during the day, and she always answers away from Isabella. She says they are confidential medical matters, but once I heard part of a conversation. What did you hear? Richard turned, facing the boy with his full attention. She was talking about money, about how the plan was working perfectly, and that soon she could finalize the transfer. I thought it was about paying for a consultation or something like that. But now... Peter shook his head. Now it seems different. A cold sensation ran through Richard's body. He thought about the various searches he had signed for Patricia throughout their relationship, facilitating bureaucratic issues related to Isabella's medical treatment. He also thought about her suggestion to create a joint account for medical emergencies and how she had offered to manage the investments intended for Isabella's future. Peter, when did you hear this conversation? About 2 weeks ago. Right after you guys got back from that trip to Aspen that weekend. Richard remembered that weekend perfectly. Patricia had suggested a romantic getaway, leaving Isabella in the care of Mary. At the time, he had felt a bit uncomfortable leaving their daughter, but Patricia argued that they needed time alone to strengthen their relationship before the wedding scheduled for December. Mr. Richard, Peter said, getting up from the armchair, there's one more thing. I don't know if it's important, but Isabella talks in her sleep. What do you mean? When my mom cleans your condo on Friday afternoons, sometimes Isabella is napping in the living room, and she says strange things in her sleep, things about wanting to run, about her feet hurting from standing still, about being afraid of not being good enough for you. The words hit Richard like daggers. Isabella had nightmares about disappointing her father, about not being enough, about carrying guilt for a condition that didn't even seem real. The psychological manipulation was so deep that it invaded even the child's dreams. Peter, Richard said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended, why did you take so long to tell me this? The boy lowered his eyes, a shy blush coloring his thin cheeks. Because I'm the son of a housekeeper, Mr. Richard. Who would believe my word against that of a wealthy doctor? And because I was afraid you would get mad at me and send my mom away. We have nowhere to go if we lose this job. The brutal honesty of those words hit, Richard, like a slap in the face. There was the very social injustice he had experienced in his childhood, reproduced before his eyes. A poor boy, witness to the truth, silenced by the fear of not being believed due to his lower social standing. In that moment, Richard made a decision that would change everything. For the first time in decades, he chose to believe a child instead of an adult. He chose to listen to the weaker voice instead of the more powerful one. "Peter," he said, placing his hand on the boy's thin shoulder, "thank you so much for having the courage to come here today. You may have saved my daughter." Continue John 12. Chapter 4. Silent Investigations. Richard spent the entire night awake, pacing the marble corridors of his condo like a caged lion. The 300-square-foot space, with its minimalist decor and panoramic city view, had never felt so cold and impersonal. Every designer piece of furniture, every work of art carefully selected by Patricia, now carried a different weight. They were symbols of a life that might have been built on lies. At 5 in the morning he made a decision. He needed to observe Isabella without Patricia knowing. He needed to see with his own eyes what Peter had described. He dressed in a simpler suit than usual and decided to work from home that Friday, something he hadn't done in months. "What a lovely surprise," Patricia exclaimed when he announced his plans during breakfast. She looked impeccable as always, wearing a beige linen suit that accentuated her perfectly styled blonde hair. "You've been working so hard lately. It will be great to have you here with us." Richard discreetly watched as she prepared Isabella's morning smoothie. The girl, sitting in her pink wheelchair, looked at the amber liquid in the glass with an expression he now recognized as resignation. It wasn't the look of a child taking vitamins. It was the look of someone submitting to something inevitable and unpleasant. "Princess." Richard crouched beside the wheelchair. "How are you feeling today?" Isabella looked up at him with her big brown eyes, a legacy from her biological mother who had died during childbirth. For a moment, Richard thought he saw a flicker of something that resembled hope, but the expression quickly faded when Dr. Patricia approached. "She's doing great, isn't she, sweetheart?" Patricia stroked Isabella's brown hair with a gesture that seemed affectionate, but Richard now perceived it as somewhat possessive. "Today we're going to do special exercises to strengthen your back muscles." After they finished their morning coffee, Richard settled into his home office but left the door ajar. From there, he could hear the sounds coming from the physical therapy room that Patricia had set up specifically for Isabella, a $50,000 investment in equipment that she claimed was essential for the treatment. Around 9 o'clock, the session began. Richard heard Patricia's soft voice giving instructions, but there was something in her tone that unsettled him. It was too sweet, too controlled, as if each word was carefully calculated. He quietly stood up and walked down the hallway until he found an angle where he could observe without being seen. The scene he witnessed made him feel nauseous. Isabella was lying on a padded table, and Patricia was manipulating her legs with movements that seemed deliberately uncomfortable. The girl grimaced in pain, but made no sound, as if she had learned that complaining was futile. "Do you feel anything here, dear?" Patricia pressed specific points on Isabella's legs, and Richard noticed that the girl clearly reacted to the touch, but always responded with a soft no. "Great. That confirms that the nerves are still severely compromised." Patricia noted something on a clipboard. "Let's continue with the passive exercises." Richard returned to the office with his heart racing. There was something deeply wrong with that session. The way Isabella reacted to the touch indicated normal sensitivity, but her verbal responses completely contradicted her physical reactions. It was as if she had been trained to deny her own sensations. An hour later, he heard Patricia answer the phone in the hallway. She spoke in a low tone, but the acoustics of the condo allowed him to catch fragments of the conversation. "Yes, the schedule is being followed to the letter." A pause. "He suspects nothing. He's completely convinced." Another longer pause. "December is confirmed. After the wedding, we will have full access to the funds." Richard's blood ran cold. He moved closer to the office door, trying to listen more, but Patricia had walked away to the bedroom. When she returned a few minutes later, she wore her usual smile and carried a cup of chamomile tea. "Honey, I made chamomile tea. You seem tense today." Richard accepted the cup but didn't drink. Instead, he watched Patricia as she returned to the physical therapy room. There was something in her movements that he had never noticed before, an almost theatrical precision, as if each gesture was part of a carefully rehearsed performance. Around noon, Patricia announced that she was going out to pick up medications from the compounding pharmacy. "I'll be gone for at least an hour." Dr. Roberts changed Isabella's vitamin complex formula. As soon as he heard the elevator descend, Richard rushed to the room where Isabella remained seated in her wheelchair, casually fiddling with a tablet. The girl looked up in surprise when he entered. "Hi, Dad. I thought you were working." "I'm taking a break." Richard pulled up a chair and sat at her level. "Isabella, can I ask you a question?" The girl nodded, but Richard noticed how she involuntarily glanced at the door, as if checking whether Patricia had really left. "How do you feel during your physical therapy sessions?" "What do you mean, Dad?" Her voice became smaller, more cautious. "Do you feel pain, discomfort, any sensations in your legs?" Isabella hesitated for a moment that felt eternal. Richard saw a silent battle happening behind those innocent eyes, the desire to tell the truth, fighting against some deeply rooted fear. "Sometimes," she finally whispered, "sometimes I feel a tickling in my legs, but Aunt Patricia said that's normal for people who can't walk, that it's just my imagination trying to trick me." "And do you believe that?" Isabella lowered her eyes. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Dad. Aunt Patricia knows a lot about these things. She's a doctor." Richard felt his heart shatter. His daughter was being gaslighted by a professional who was using her medical authority to manipulate an 8-year-old child. It was a form of abuse so subtle and psychologically sophisticated that it bordered on cruel genius. "Isabella," he said gently, "would you like to be able to walk?" Tears instantly welled up in the girl's eyes. "Every day, Dad, every day I dream that I'm running in the park, playing with the other kids. But Aunt Patricia said that if I keep feeding those fantasies, you'll be sad, because you'll think I don't accept my condition. And what if I told you that I would be happy if you could walk? That it doesn't matter whether you can or can't, I just want you to be happy?" Isabella looked at him with a genuinely surprised expression. "Would you really say that even knowing I might be a defective daughter?" The word defective, coming from his 8-year-old daughter, felt like a dagger to Richard's chest. He scooped her up, wheelchair and all, and hugged her tightly. "Isabella, you will never, ever be defective to me. You are perfect just the way you are." For a few minutes they stayed like that, father and daughter embracing in a room full of medical equipment that might have been completely unnecessary. And for the first time in months, Richard heard his daughter cry for real, not the contained and silent sobs she had learned to suppress, but deep sobs from a child who finally felt safe to express her pain. When Dr. Patricia Collins returned from the compounding pharmacy, she found a seemingly normal scene. Richard working on his laptop while Isabella watched cartoons on the tablet. But something fundamental had changed in that condo. For the first time, father and daughter shared a secret, and it was a secret that could destroy the world that Patricia had carefully built. Cadude 114, Chapter 5. The discovery that changed everything. The following Saturday, Richard woke up with a determination he hadn't felt in years. Throughout the week, he had discreetly observed every move Patricia made, every interaction she had with Isabella, every detail that had previously gone unnoticed. Now, under the harsh light of suspicion, everything seemed sinister and calculated. Patricia had suggested spending the day at the shopping mall, claiming that Isabella needed new clothes and that it would be therapeutic for her to socialize in busy environments. Richard agreed, but with a secret plan. He had scheduled an emergency appointment with Dr. Fernando Collins, a pediatric neurologist at the Children's Hospital, for Monday. It would be a second opinion that Patricia wouldn't know about. The mall was crowded that August Saturday. Entire families wandered through the marble corridors. Children ran between the stores while parents chased after them, and the sound of conversations in various languages created a typical urban symphony of New York. Richard pushed Isabella's wheelchair, noticing how she watched the other children playing freely with a hint of melancholy. "Shall we go to the toy store?" Patricia suggested, pointing to a colorful display at the toy store. "I'm sure Isabella will love to see the new releases." As they walked through the mall, Richard noticed something he had never seen before. Patricia constantly directed the wheelchair towards areas with more movement, more people watching. It was as if she wanted Isabella to be seen in her condition, as if it were part of some public performance. In the toy store, while Patricia distracted herself chatting with a saleswoman about dolls designed for children with special needs, Richard approached Isabella. "Which toy would you like to have?" he asked quietly. Isabella discreetly pointed to a pink children's bike with training wheels. "That one, Daddy. But I know I can't use it." "Why do you think you can't?" Aunt Patricia explained that bikes are dangerous for kids like me, that I could get really hurt if I tried to pedal. Richard looked at the bike, a simple model suitable for beginner children with all the necessary safety features. There was nothing that could be considered dangerous for a normal child. The prohibition was yet another layer of psychological limitation imposed by Patricia. "What if I bought that bike for you?" Richard asked impulsively. Isabella's eyes lit up for a second, but then dimmed again. "Aunt Patricia would be very angry. She said you already spend too much money on me because of the treatments, and that I shouldn't ask for things I can't use." Once again, Richard felt anger rising within him. Patricia had created a system where Isabella felt guilty not only for her supposed disability, but also for the financial costs she supposedly generated. It was a cruel manipulation that simultaneously attacked the child's self-esteem and sense of self-worth. "Sweetheart, what are you two talking about?" Patricia appeared beside them with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Isabella was admiring that bike," Richard said, testing his fiancée's reaction. "Oh, how cute!" Patricia stroked Isabella's hair with a gesture that seemed affectionate, but which Richard now perceived as possessive. "But you know that bikes aren't for you, right, dear? We have to be realistic about your limitations." The word limitations was pronounced with a toxic sweetness that made Richard feel nauseous. He watched as Isabella shrank in her wheelchair, as if trying to become invisible. "But maybe in the future," Richard said, "as the treatment progresses—" "Richard," Patricia interrupted him with a slightly firmer tone, "we shouldn't feed unrealistic hopes. It's important that Isabella accepts her condition so we can focus on appropriate treatments for her situation." At that moment, while watching Patricia talk about acceptance and limitations, Richard had a disturbing epiphany. All of Patricia's rhetoric was about conformity, about accepting a condition that might not even exist. A truly committed physical therapist should be nurturing hope, celebrating small progress, encouraging attempts to improve. During lunch at the Japanese restaurant in the mall, Richard watched closely as Patricia controlled every aspect of Isabella's meal. She cut the sushi into smaller pieces than necessary, insisted on feeding the girl to prevent her from choking, and constantly wiped her hands and face as if she were a much younger child. "Patricia," Richard said casually, "shouldn't Isabella be developing more autonomy during meals? She's already 8 years old." "Children with neurological limitations may have slower reflexes," Patricia replied without hesitation. "It's safer for me to help her. We don't want unnecessary accidents." Richard watched Isabella passively accept being fed like a baby and felt a deep sadness. His daughter was being infantilized, her natural abilities systematically suppressed under the guise of medical care. On the way home, while Patricia drove and talked about wedding plans for December, Richard pretended to sleep in the passenger seat. In reality, he was intensely thinking about how to proceed. He needed concrete evidence, not just suspicions and observations. When they arrived home, Patricia announced that she was going to take a shower before dinner. Richard seized the opportunity to discreetly enter her office, a small room she had adapted to store medical files and physical therapy equipment. What he found there made his blood run cold. In a drawer that should have been locked, but that Patricia had forgotten to close, Richard discovered a folder with documents that completely changed his perception of reality. There were neurological exams of Isabella dated 3 years ago, exams he had never seen, showing completely normal results. There were also handwritten notes in... Patricia's handwriting detailed a maintenance protocol that included administering mild muscle relaxants and psychological reinforcement of dependency. But the document that shocked him the most was a life insurance policy in Isabella's name, with Patricia as the beneficiary, taken out just 2 months after they started dating. The amount was $2 million. With trembling hands, Richard photographed each document with his cell phone. The truth was there, in black and white. Patricia was not treating Isabella. She was systematically sabotaging her physical and psychological health for financial reasons, and her plan went far beyond stealing her fortune. It included an insurance policy that would only make sense if something happened to the child. "Richard, are you there?" Patricia's voice echoed down the hallway. He quickly tucked the documents away in the drawer and left the office, pretending he was just looking for a cell phone charger. But inside, a revolution had begun. He now knew he was not just dealing with a con artist, he was facing someone capable of putting a child's life at risk for money. That night, while Patricia slept peacefully beside him, Richard stayed awake, planning every move of his counteroffensive. His daughter had been turned into a prisoner in her own home, and he had only one chance to save her before it was too late. The man who had built a financial empire through meticulous strategies would now use all those skills to destroy the woman who had tried to destroy his family. Continue 0119, Chapter 6, The Inevitable Confrontation. On Monday morning, Richard woke up at 5 o'clock with a mental clarity he hadn't experienced in months. He had spent the entire Sunday organizing his strategy as if it were a military operation. The first step would be the secret medical consultation with Dr. James Carter. But before that, he needed to ensure that Isabella was safe during his absence. He called Mary before 6 in the morning, asking her to come in early. The woman, always helpful, did not ask questions, but Richard noticed the concern in her voice when he mentioned that he needed some special care for Isabella during the afternoon. "Patricia," he said during breakfast, keeping his voice casual while watching his fiancée prepare the suspicious morning syrup for Isabella, "I have an important meeting this afternoon. I might be a bit late getting home." "No problem, love." Patricia smiled as she handed the cup to Isabella. "Isabella and I have a long physical therapy session scheduled anyway. We're going to work on strengthening her abdominal muscles." Richard watched his daughter accept the medication with resignation and felt a controlled fury growing in his chest. In just a few hours he would know for sure if his suspicions were correct. Dr. James Carter's office was located in the Children's Hospital, one of the most renowned in New York. Richard had chosen this professional specifically because he had no connections with Patricia and because his reputation as a pediatric neurologist was impeccable. The appointment was set for 3 in the afternoon, a time when Patricia would be busy with physical therapy sessions at home. Mr. Anderson, Dr. Carter was a man in his 60s, with grey hair and a gentle gaze behind discreet glasses. On the phone you mentioned that you wanted a second opinion regarding your daughter's case. Did you bring the previous exams? Richard handed over a folder containing all the reports that Patricia had provided over the 2 years of their relationship. Doctor, I need to know the truth about my daughter's condition, no matter how painful that truth may be. Dr. Carter meticulously examined each document, frowning as he progressed through the reading. After 20 minutes of silent analysis, he removed his glasses and looked at Richard with a serious expression. Mr. Anderson, I need to be direct with you. These reports show several serious inconsistencies. Richard's heart raced. What kind of inconsistencies? First, the dates of the exams do not match the standard protocols for the type of injury described. Second, some of the equipment mentioned in the reports does not exist in the hospitals indicated as the locations for the exams. Dr. Carter pointed to specific documents. And third, more concerning, the progression described in the report suggests a deterioration that would be impossible for the type of injury initially diagnosed. Are you saying these exams are fake? I'm saying there are strong indications of forgery. But more importantly, Dr. Carter leaned forward, based on the symptoms you described over the phone, preserved sensitivity, involuntary movements, normal reactions to stimuli, there is nothing to indicate a real neurological injury. Richard felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath his feet. So my daughter can walk. Based solely on these reports and what you've told me, I would say not only can she, but she probably never lost that ability. But to be absolutely sure, I would need to examine the child in person. Is that possible? Without the current physical therapist knowing? Dr. Carter hesitated for a moment. Mr. Anderson, what you're suggesting are very serious accusations against a healthcare professional. If we're right, we're talking about child abuse and illegal practice of medicine. Doctor, my daughter may be being poisoned with unnecessary medications and held in psychological captivity for 2 years. I need to be sure. The gravity in Richard's voice convinced the doctor. Very well. I can examine her tomorrow morning, but we would need a plausible reason to bring her here without raising suspicions. Richard thought quickly. Patricia always insists on attending all medical appointments. But if I say I need to bring Isabella in for routine exams related to work, an executive checkup that the company requires for employee dependents. Perfect. At 9 o'clock in the morning, then. When Richard arrived home at 6 in the evening, he found a scene that made him feel nauseous. Isabella was lying on a treatment table in the physical therapy room with electrodes connected to her. As Patricia applied what she called therapeutic electrical stimulation to Isadora's legs, the girl had silent tears streaming down her face. "How was your day?" he asked, forcing a casual tone. "Excellent," Patricia replied cheerfully, disconnecting the electrodes. "Isabella was very brave during her exercises today. We are making real progress in muscle strengthening." Richard observed Isabella flinch as Patricia helped her back into the wheelchair. The girl avoided eye contact with him, as if she were ashamed of something. "Isabella, how do you feel?" "Tired, Dad," she replied in a small voice. "But Aunt Patricia said it's normal to feel pain when the muscles are working to get stronger." "Exactly," Patricia quickly added. Isn't that right, sweetheart? As I always explain to you, progress in cases like Isabella's is slow and sometimes uncomfortable, but it's necessary to maintain residual muscle function. At that moment, watching his daughter passively accept an explanation for why it was normal to feel pain during a treatment that was likely unnecessary, Richard made an irrevocable decision. It didn't matter what the consequences would be for his relationship with Patricia. It didn't matter how much money he had already invested in the equipment and treatments. It didn't matter how much time he had wasted believing her lies. "Patricia," he said, his voice carrying a new firmness, "I need to talk to you, privately." They went to the bedroom, leaving Isabella watching television in the living room. Richard closed the door and faced the woman who had occupied his bed and his life for the past 2 years. "I want a second medical opinion about Isabella." Patricia blinked, her expression of surprise seeming genuine. "Why? Is something worrying you?" "I'm not satisfied with the speed of progress. I want to hear from other specialists." "Richard," Patricia stepped closer to him, placing her hands on his chest in a gesture that used to be comforting. "You know I have the best contacts in the field. If a second opinion were necessary, I would have suggested it already. Even so, I want to do this. As a father, it's my right." For a fraction of a second, Richard saw something pass through Patricia's eyes. A flash of something cold and calculating that disappeared so quickly he almost thought he imagined it. "Of course, sweetheart. You're right." "Actually," she smiled, but the smile didn't seem natural. "How about we schedule an appointment with Dr. Robert Smith? He's a neurologist at the General Hospital and a colleague from my college. I'm sure he will confirm our diagnosis." "Thank you, but I've already scheduled with someone else. Dr. James Carter from the Children's Hospital." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but to Richard it felt like an eternity. He saw Patricia processing the information, saw the gears turning behind those blue eyes that once seemed so sincere. "When?" she finally asked. "Tomorrow morning." That night, while having dinner as a family, Richard watched Patricia's every move with new attention. He noticed how she monopolized the conversation, how she directed Isabella's responses, how she subtly discouraged any display of independence from the girl. It was such a well-rehearsed performance that he wondered how many other families had fallen victim to the same scheme. When they went to bed, Patricia was too quiet, lost in thoughts that Richard now knew were dangerous. He pretended to fall asleep, but remained alert, every sense heightened. Around 2 in the morning, he heard quiet footsteps in the hallway. Patricia had gotten up and was doing something in Isabella's room. Richard waited 10 minutes before quietly getting up to investigate. What he found sent a chill down his spine. Patricia was injecting something into the IV line that was permanently installed in Isabella's arm, justifying it as an emergency medication administration route. The girl was sleeping deeply, unaware that she was being medicated in the middle of the night. Richard returned to the bedroom, pretending to continue sleeping, but inside he was formulating an emergency plan. Patricia was accelerating some protocol, likely trying to ensure that Isabella was in a certain state for the medical appointment the next day. What she didn't know was that Richard had already documented everything, already had the necessary evidence, and that the appointment with Dr. Carter would only be the final confirmation that his daughter was being held captive by a sociopath using medical knowledge for criminal purposes. The war had begun, and Richard was determined to win. Continue 0122, Chapter 7. The Truth Revealed. Richard spent the rest of the night planning every detail for the following morning. At 5 o'clock, he quietly got up and went to check on Isabella. The girl was sleeping deeply, with a pallor that was not normal. Whatever Patricia had injected into her was taking effect. He discreetly photographed the IV line. noting a small recent needle mark that confirmed his suspicions. "Good morning, Princess," he whispered, gently stroking Isabella's hair. The girl stirred but did not fully wake, another sign that she had been medicated beyond normal levels. At 7 in the morning, during breakfast, Patricia was visibly tense. She prepared Isabella's morning syrup with mechanical movements, and Richard noticed that her hands trembled slightly. "Sweetheart," she said, forcing a smile, "I've been thinking about this appointment today. Maybe we should reschedule for next week. Isabella seems a bit unwell this morning." "Actually," Richard replied, observing how Isabella struggled to keep her eyes open, "I think that's exactly why we need to go. If she's feeling unwell, it's important for a doctor to evaluate her." Patricia couldn't completely hide the flash of panic in her eyes. "Richard, as a physical therapist, I can assess if—" "Patricia." Richard's voice came out firmer than he intended. "We are going to the doctor today. It's a done deal." The tense silence was broken by the arrival of Mary, who came to do the morning cleaning. The woman greeted everyone politely, but Richard noticed how her gaze lingered on Isabella, noting the girl's lethargic state. "Mary," Richard said casually, "Isabella will need care. Are you paying attention to her?" Mary nodded, and Richard saw a silent understanding pass between them. The housekeeper was a mother. She recognized when a child was not well. At 8:30, Richard placed Isabella in the wheelchair to head out. The girl was awake, but clearly drowsy and disoriented. Dr. Patricia insisted on accompanying them. "Of course I'm going with you," she said, grabbing her medical bag. "I need to explain Isabella's entire treatment history to Dr. Carter." "That won't be necessary," Richard replied firmly. "I've already emailed all the reports. This appointment is just for me to hear an independent opinion. Richard, it doesn't make sense for me not to go. I'm the professional who knows her case best." The wire tension in the air was palpable. Richard knew he was walking a tightrope. If Patricia completely suspected his intentions, she could take drastic measures. But he also knew he couldn't allow her to control another medical appointment. "Patricia, I need to do this alone. As a father." For a moment, Richard thought she would argue more intensely, but then Patricia smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. "All right, dear, but call me immediately after the appointment, okay? I'll be worried." During the drive to the hospital, Isabella slept in the back seat of the car. Richard watched her through the rearview mirror, noting how her breathing was slower than usual. Whatever substance Patricia had administered, it was clearly affecting the girl's central nervous system. At the children's hospital, Dr. Carter welcomed them into his private office. It was a warm environment with comfortable chairs and educational toys scattered around to make children feel at ease. "Good morning, Isabella," the doctor addressed the girl directly with a gentle smile. "I'm Dr. James. Your dad told me you're a very brave girl." Isabella stared at him with sleepy eyes but managed to smile shyly. "Hi, Doctor." "Isabella?" Dr. Carter knelt beside the wheelchair. "I'm going to do some very simple tests, okay? Nothing that will hurt. It's like a game." The doctor started with basic reflex tests. When he tapped Isabella's foot with a reflex hammer, the reaction was immediate and normal. The girl clearly felt the touch, and her foot contracted reflexively. "Did you feel that, Isabella?" The girl hesitated, looking at Richard as if asking for permission to answer. "A little bit." "A little bit or very clearly?" Dr. Carter gently insisted. "Very clearly," she whispered, as if confessing a secret. Dr. Carter continued the tests. He asked Isabella to try moving her toes. She succeeded. He asked her to push her feet against his hands. She exerted considerable force. He tested her sensitivity at different points on her legs. She reacted normally to all. "Isabella, can you stand up?" The question made the girl look at Richard with clear panic in her eyes. "I can't, Doctor. Dr. Patricia said it's dangerous to try." But would you like to try if it weren't dangerous? Tears began to well up in Isabella's eyes. I dream about it every night, Doctor. I dream that I'm running in the park with other kids. Dr. Carter exchanged a meaningful glance with Richard. Isabella, how about we try together? I'm a doctor, so I know how to do it safely. With Dr. Carter's help, Isabella placed her feet on the ground. Her legs trembled, not from muscular weakness, but from fear and 2 years of disuse. Slowly, supported by the doctor, she managed to stand up. "Daddy!" she shouted, laughing and crying at the same time. "Daddy, I'm standing!" Richard quickly approached, lifting his daughter into his arms. "You are, Princess. You are standing." "Can I walk, Daddy? Can I really walk?" Dr. Carter nodded. "With proper physical therapy, to regain the muscle tone lost from inactivity, you should be able to walk normally within a few weeks." Isabella burst into tears, tears of relief, joy, and liberation. "I knew something was wrong. I could feel my legs, but everyone said I was imagining it." "You weren't imagining anything, my love." Richard hugged her tightly, his own tears falling freely. "Your legs have always worked. Someone was making you believe they didn't." Dr. Carter examined the medications that Patricia had prescribed for Isabella. "Mr. Anderson, this medication contains muscle relaxants and mild sedatives. In prolonged doses, they can cause artificial muscle weakness and chronic drowsiness. There is no medical justification for a healthy child to be taking this." "Doctor, what do I do now?" "First, we stop this medication immediately, but gradually, to avoid withdrawal syndrome. Second, we start real physical therapy to regain muscle strength. And third," Dr. Carter hesitated, "you need to consider involving the authorities. What has been done to your daughter is not just medical malpractice, it is child abuse." Richard looked at Isabella, who was still trying to stand on her own, holding on to the office table. 2 years of stolen life. 2 years of suppressed dreams. 2 years of a child believing she was defective when in fact she was being deliberately sabotaged. "Doctor, can I leave Isabella here while I sort out a situation at home? It's not safe for her to go back now." "Of course. We have a pediatric wing where she can stay under observation while we begin the process of detoxifying from the medications." Richard knelt down to Isabella's level. "Princess, you're going to stay here with Dr. James for a few hours while Daddy takes care of some important things. You're safe here, okay?" "Daddy, will Dr. Patricia be mad at me?" "No, my love. Dr. Patricia will never be able to hurt you again. Daddy will make sure of that." When Richard left the hospital, he was no longer the man who had entered 3 hours earlier. He was a father who had discovered that his daughter had been a victim of one of the cruelest forms of abuse, medical and psychological manipulation, by someone he had completely trusted. And now he was going to... Richard drove back home with a mix of controlled fury and absolute determination coursing through his veins. During the ride, he called his personal lawyer, Dr. Marcus Veloso, one of the most respected criminal attorneys in New York. "Marcus, I need you to come to my condo right now and bring a child crime specialist. It's urgent." "Richard, what the hell is going on?" "I'll explain when you get here, but I want you to know I'm reporting my fiancée for child abuse and fraud, and I have all the evidence." When he arrived at the building, Richard found the doorman, Mr. Johnson, watering the plants in the indoor garden. The 60-year-old man had worked there for over a decade and knew all the residents. "Mr. Johnson," Richard approached discreetly, "I need to ask you something important. Does Dr. Patricia receive visitors when I'm not home?" The doorman hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm not sure I should say, Mr. Anderson." "Mr. Johnson, it's about my daughter's safety. I need to know." "Well," the man looked around, making sure they were alone, "there's a guy who comes here sometimes, always when you're at work. He identifies himself as a physical therapy assistant for the doctor. What does he look like? Tall, dark hair, about 30, always carries a medical bag, stays for about 2 hours and then leaves. Richard felt his stomach churn. Patricia had an accomplice, someone who helped her during the sessions. Probably another corrupt professional involved in the scheme of falsifying reports and administering unnecessary medications. "Mr. Johnson, has this guy been here today?" "No, sir, but he usually comes on Thursdays." Richard thanked him and went up to his condo, his mind racing. He had less than an hour before Marcus arrived, and he needed to confront Patricia alone first. He wanted to see her reaction when she discovered that her entire scheme had been uncovered. He found Patricia in the physical therapy room, nervously organizing equipment. She turned when he entered, and Richard immediately saw that something had changed in her expression. The mask of sweetness and concern had fallen, revealing harder, calculating features. "How was the appointment?" she asked, but her voice sounded tense. "Enlightening," Richard replied, closing the door behind him. "Dr. Carter ran some interesting tests on Isabella." "Oh, really? And what did he conclude?" Patricia continued fiddling with the equipment, avoiding direct eye contact. "That she can walk perfectly. In fact, that she has always been able to walk." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia stopped, moving, her hands freezing in the air. Slowly, she turned to face him, and Richard saw that the mask had completely fallen. The eyes that once seemed affectionate now glinted with something cold and dangerous. "Where is Isabella?" she asked, her voice now stripped of any pretense. "Safe, away from you." Patricia laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Richard, you have no idea what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm protecting my daughter from a sociopath who kept her imprisoned for 2 years. Imprisoned? Patricia stepped closer to him, and Richard saw for the first time the true person behind the facade. "I saved that girl, Richard. Do you want to know the truth? She isn't even your daughter." The words hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. "What did you say?" "The dear Isabella that you love so much doesn't carry a drop of your blood. Her biological mother was a junkie who died of an overdose. I got the forged documents so you would believe she was your daughter." Richard felt the world spin around him. "You're lying." "Am I? Why do you think we never did paternity tests? Why do you think I always discouraged any deep medical investigation?" Patricia smiled cruelly. "Because I knew the truth would eventually come out." "Even if that were true," Richard said, his voice trembling with contained rage, "it doesn't change the fact that you abused an innocent child, that you drugged her, psychologically manipulated her, and kept her in physical and emotional captivity." "I kept her alive!" Patricia shouted, completely losing her composure. "Do you know what happens to orphaned children in the foster care system? She was destined for child prostitution or worse. I saved her, gave her a life of luxury. You turned her into a prisoner in her own home. I turned her into a source of income." Patricia laughed bitterly. "And you, Richard Anderson, the great savvy businessman, fell for it. 2 years paying for expensive treatments, medical equipment, special medications, all going straight to accounts I control." The explicit confession made Richard feel nauseous. "And the life insurance policy?" Patricia's eyes narrowed dangerously. "How do you know about that?" "I know about everything, Patricia. The forged tests, the unnecessary medications, the nighttime injections, your accomplice who comes here on Thursdays." For a moment, Richard saw genuine fear in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by something more dangerous, desperation. "Richard," she said, completely changing tactics, trying to regain her soft, manipulative tone, "you don't understand. I did this for us. All this money was to secure our future together. After the wedding, we could have lived comfortably forever, at the expense of an innocent child's stolen childhood. "She isn't even your daughter," Patricia shouted again. "Why do you care so much about some random orphan?" "Because I was once a random orphan," Richard replied, his voice heavy with deep emotion. "And because I learned that family isn't about blood. It's about love, protection, and care, things you never understood." Patricia stared at him for a long moment, processing his words. Then, like a cornered animal, she lunged at him, the final attack. "Do you want to know the whole truth, Richard? Isabella has a sister, an identical twin who is still in the system, and I know exactly where to find her." She smiled cruelly. "If you report me, I guarantee you will never see either of them again." The explicit threat against children was the last straw for Richard. In 2 decades of building businesses, he had learned to recognize when someone was bluffing, and Patricia was not. "Patricia," he said, his voice taking on a dangerously calm tone, "you just confessed to child abuse, fraud, extortion, and now threats against minors, and you did it in front of witnesses." "What witnesses?" She looked around the empty room. Richard discreetly pointed to the upper corner of the room, where one of the security cameras he had secretly installed the week before was recording everything. "My lawyer should be arriving in a few minutes, along with representatives from the district attorney's office, and our entire conversation from the last 20 minutes is being streamed live to my phone, which is recording everything." Patricia's face went completely pale. "You can't do this." "I not only can, but I already have. The game is over, Patricia." At that moment, the doorbell of the condo rang. Marcus had arrived, and with him, the beginning of the end of the nightmare that Isabella had lived for 2 years. Patricia looked at the door, then at Richard, and finally at the camera that had documented her complete confession. For the first time since he had met her, Richard saw the real Patricia, not the caring physical therapist, not the devoted fiancée, but a desperate criminal whose world had just crumbled, and he knew at that moment that he had finally won the war for his daughter's soul. Continues 0125. Chapter 9. The Web of Lies Unraveled. The front door opened, revealing not only Dr. Marcus Veloso, but also a detective from the civil police specializing in crimes against children, Officer Helen Roberts, and 2 agents from the district attorney's office. Richard had underestimated how quickly his lawyer could mobilize the authorities when it came to child abuse. Dr. Patricia Collins, the detective, addressed the woman who was now visibly in a panic. "You are being taken in for questioning regarding allegations of child abuse, illegal practice of medicine, and fraud." Patricia tried to regain her professional composure. "There must be some misunderstanding. I am a licensed physical therapist and was only treating Mr. Anderson's daughter according to established medical protocols." "Ma'am," Dr. Marcus intervened, showing a folder full of documents. "We have evidence that you administered unnecessary medications to a minor, forged medical reports, and kept the child in an artificially incapacitated state for 2 years. Detective Helen approached Richard. "Mr. Anderson, where is the minor at this moment?" "At the Children's Hospital, under the care of Dr. James Carter. She is undergoing detoxification from the medications that were improperly administered." "And the physical evidence?" Richard handed over a folder he had meticulously prepared. Photographs of the medications, recordings of her confessions from just minutes ago, contradictory medical documents, and receipts for suspicious financial transfers. As the authorities examined the documents, Patricia made one last desperate attempt. "You don't understand. Isabella isn't even his biological daughter. I have proof that the entire paternity is based on forged documents." Detective Helen looked up from the documents. "Ma'am, even If that were true, it would not justify the crimes you're being accused of committing. On the contrary, it would be another crime, document forgery. Moreover, Dr. Marcus added, even if there were no biological ties, Mr. Anderson has had legal custody of the minor for over 2 years. He is, legally and emotionally, her father. At that moment, Mary quietly appeared in the room, carrying a bucket of cleaning supplies. But Richard noticed that she was deliberately positioning herself to listen to the conversation. Detective Helen also noticed her presence. "Are you a housekeeper?" Mary nodded nervously. "I'm the housekeeper, Mom, and I need to say something important." "Go ahead." "I always knew something was wrong with Isabella's treatment," Mary said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "My son Peter told me strange things, and I myself saw Dr. Patricia doing things that didn't seem right." "What kind of things?" the detective asked. "I saw her injecting things into the child when she was sleeping. I saw her secretly putting medicine in the girl's food. And once, when Dr. Patricia thought no one was home, I saw the girl walking normally around the house." Patricia exploded. "This woman is just a housekeeper. She has no medical education to understand complex treatments." "I may not have an education, ma'am," Mary replied with dignity, "but I have eyes, and I know when a child is suffering." Detective Helen turned to Patricia. "Ma'am, from this moment on, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you." It was then that Patricia made her last desperate move. "Do you want to know the whole truth? I wasn't working alone." The silence in the room was total. Dr. Marcus leaned forward. "Continue." "Dr. Robert Smith from the General Hospital, Dr. Anna Smith, radiologist, Nurse Paul Johnson. They were all part of the scheme. We had a network of professionals who forged tests and reports for wealthy families." The confession was like a bomb exploding in the room. Richard realized they had uncovered not just an isolated case of abuse, but a true medical mafia exploiting vulnerable families. "How many families were victims?" the detective asked. "At least 15 in the last 5 years. Always the same pattern. Rich men, divorced or widowed, with young children. We created fictitious medical conditions, installed emotional dependency, and gradually took financial control." Richard felt nauseous, realizing that he was not just a victim, but part of an elaborate criminal pattern. "And the other children?" "Some really developed psychological problems due to the prolonged medications. Others—" Patricia hesitated. "Other what?" the detective insisted. "Others did not survive the excessive doses of sedatives." The silence that followed was grave. Richard felt as if the ground had opened beneath his feet. They were not just dealing with fraud or abuse. They were facing murders. Dr. Marcus was the first to speak. "Detective, we need police protection for Mr. Anderson and his daughter. If there is a criminal network involved, they may try to silence witnesses." "I've already arranged it," Detective Helen confirmed. "There will be 24-hour protection for both them and the other families we identify as victims." Patricia was handcuffed and led out of the condo. Before leaving, she turned one last time to Richard. "Do you think you've won? When you discover the whole truth about Isabella, about who she really is and where she came from, you'll understand that I did her a favor, and you—" Richard stared at her with a calmness he did not feel. "It doesn't matter where she came from or who she was before. She is my daughter now, and I will protect her from people like you for the rest of my life." After the authorities left with Patricia, Richard sat heavily in the armchair in the living room. Mary approached timidly. "Mr. Richard, can I say something?" He nodded, still in shock from the revelations. "My Peter always said that the girl Isabella had eyes too sad for a rich child who had everything. Now I understand why. She didn't have everything. She didn't have freedom. Richard looked at Mary, this simple woman who had the courage to speak the truth when all the experts were lying. "Mary, thank you. If you hadn't spoken up, I would never have found out." "We did what was right, Mr. Richard. A child must be protected, no matter where she comes from or who her parents are." That afternoon, while waiting for permission to pick up Isabella from the hospital, Richard reflected on everything that had happened. He had discovered that his daughter might not be biologically his, but he also discovered that it didn't matter at all. He had found out that he had been a victim of a sophisticated criminal network, but he also learned that true love came from the simplest people around him. And more importantly, he discovered that his daughter was alive, she was free, and she could finally run, play, and dream like any child deserved. The battle had been won, but the journey of rebuilding and healing was just beginning. Continue. Era 127. Chapter 10. A New Beginning. 6 months later, on a sunny February morning, Richard watched from the window of his new home in Aspen as Isabella ran freely in the garden with Peter. The laughter of the two children echoed through the pure mountain air, creating a symphony of joy that he never thought he would hear again. The move to the countryside had been strategic. After the scandal that shook the medical system in New York, with the arrest of 15 professionals involved in Patricia's criminal network, Richard decided that his family needed a fresh start, away from the media spotlight and painful memories. "Daddy, look!" Isabella shouted from the garden, jumping from a small mound of dirt that Peter had built as an improvised ramp. Her brown hair flew in the wind, and her smile radiated a happiness that seemed impossible just 6 months before. Richard waved from the window, his heart filling with deep gratitude. The physical therapy with Dr. Carter had exceeded all expectations. Within 3 months, Isabella had fully regained her muscle strength and coordination. Neurological exams confirmed that she had never had any injury. Her disability had been entirely fabricated through medication and psychological manipulation. "Mr. Richard," Mary appeared at the door of the living room, carrying a tray with coffee and homemade sweetbread. She now lived in a small house on the property, officially as a housekeeper, but in practice as an integral part of the family. "A letter has arrived from the lawyers." Richard took the envelope with some apprehension. In recent months, he had received several legal communications related to the criminal case against Patricia and her accomplices. The ex-fiancée was in preventive detention, awaiting trial on more than 50 charges, including involuntary manslaughter of 2 children who did not survive her treatments. But this letter was different. It came from the juvenile court. "Mary," Richard said after quickly reading the document, "can you call the children? I have important news to share." Minutes later, Isabella and Peter were sitting on the porch of the house, still catching their breath from running, while Mary served the afternoon snack. The scene was perfect. The lush mountains in the background, the scent of pine in the air, and the feeling of peace that only places far from urban hustle can provide. "Isabella," Richard began, carefully choosing his words, "remember, we talked about your story before you came to live with me." The girl nodded, licking strawberry jam from her fingers. In the psychological therapy sessions they had been doing together since leaving the hospital, she had gradually processed the truth about her origins and the abuses she had suffered. "The letter that arrived today brings news about your biological family." Isabella's eyes lit up with curiosity, but without the fear that usually accompanied this subject. Months of therapy and unconditional love had given her the emotional security to deal with her own story. "You have a twin sister, Isabella. Her name is Isabella, and she is in an adoptive family in Springfield. But," Richard paused, "this family is not able to care for her properly, and the court is asking if we would like to meet her." The silence that followed was broken by Peter. "So, Isabella is going to have a sister just like her? That's right, Richard smiled. Identical twins, practically the same physically. Isabella processed the information with the maturity she had developed after all the experiences she had lived through. Daddy, if she is my sister, have you gone through bad things too? Unfortunately, yes, but nothing compared to what you went through. Isabella is in a family that simply doesn't have the financial means to care for her. Can she come live with us? Isabella asked without hesitation. Her daughter's quick and generous response made Richard feel immense pride. After years of being a victim of someone who pretended to love for financial gain, Isabella had maintained her ability to love genuinely and to want to share her happiness. If you want to, and if she wants to as well, yes. But it would be a very important decision. It would mean our family would grow, and you would have to share attention, toys, space. Dad, Isabella interrupted him. For 2 years I couldn't even walk. Now I can run, jump, play, and I have you, Mary. And Peter as family. Having a sister would only make everything better. Mary, who had been silently following the conversation, approached and stroked Isabella's hair. Blessed girl, after so much bad, your heart is still as big as the world. And there's another thing, Richard continued. The legal process against Patricia revealed that she had stolen money from several families. Part of that money was recovered and will be used to create a protection fund for children who are victims of medical abuse. Would you like to be part of that? What do you mean, Dad? Well, you could help other children who went through what you went through. Tell your story. Show that recovery is possible. Give hope to other families. Isabella reflected for a moment, swinging her legs on the porch chair. Will the other children be able to walk again? Many will, and they will all need to know that they can be happy again. Then I want to help. That afternoon, while watching Isabella and Peter play in the garden, Richard reflected on the extraordinary journey they had taken. He had started as a successful but emotionally closed businessman, living a perfectly organized life, but empty of genuine connections. He had almost lost the most precious thing in his life by trusting a person who saw children as financial opportunities instead of human beings worthy of love and protection. But he had discovered something fundamental. Family was not about DNA or legal documents. It was about choosing to love, protect, and care for each other unconditionally. Mary and Peter had become his family just as much as Isabella. And soon, perhaps Isabella would also be part of this circle of love. 3 weeks later, on a March morning, Richard, Isabella, Mary, and Peter traveled to Springfield to meet Isabella. The meeting took place at the city's municipal park, a neutral environment where the two girls could get to know each other without pressure. When Isabella appeared accompanied by the social worker, Isabella was speechless. They were truly identical, the same brown hair, the same large expressive eyes, the same height and build. The only difference was in the gaze. Isabella carried a deep sadness that painfully reminded Isabella of how she used to be. "Hi," Isabella said shyly, approaching her sister. "I'm Isabella, and you're Isabella, right?" The conversation between the two was initially hesitant, but gradually transformed into a natural and deep connection. Isabella shared about her life in the foster family. There was no abuse, but there was emotional neglect and financial difficulties that always left her insecure about her future. "Do you want to come live with us?" Isabella asked directly, with the typical honesty of children. "Can I really?" Isabella looked at Richard with cautious hope in her eyes. "If you want to, and if your current family agrees, of course you can. Our home has space for another daughter. The adoption process for Isabella took another 3 months, but by the end of June, she officially became part of the family. The adjustment was surprisingly smooth. The twins seemed to share not only physical appearance, but also tastes, dreams, and an impressive ability to find joy in the simple things in life. By the end of December, exactly 1 year after discovering the truth about Patricia, the family organized a late summer festival in the garden of their home in Aspen. There were colorful banners, accordion music, typical foods prepared by Mary, and neighborhood children running freely on the lawn. Richard watched from a distance as Isabella and Peter danced with other local children. The two girls ran, laughed, and played with the naturalness of those who had never known limitations. It was hard to believe that just a year earlier, one of them had been trapped in an unnecessary wheelchair, drugged daily, and believing she was defective. "Mr. Anderson," Mary approached, "can I say something?" "Of course, Mary. You saved those girls, but they also saved you." Richard smiled, watching his daughters, because now they were definitely his daughters, regardless of genetics or legal paperwork. "You know, Mary, you're right. I spent my whole life trying to control everything, organize everything, predict everything. But the best things in my life came precisely when I stopped trying to control and started to simply love. And Peter, what a brave boy. If he hadn't spoken..." "Peter taught me that sometimes the truth comes from the most unlikely voices, and that we need to listen to children, especially when they are trying to protect other children." As the party continued around them, with music, dancing, and the contagious joy of children playing freely, Richard thought about all the lessons he had learned in the past year. He had discovered that true wealth was not measured in bank numbers, but in moments of genuine happiness shared with those we love. He had learned that protection did not mean control, but rather creating environments where others could flourish freely. And more importantly, he had understood that family was a daily choice of love, care, and mutual protection, something that transcended any traditional or legal definition. When the party ended and the children fell asleep, exhausted but happy, Richard found himself alone on the porch, gazing at the stars in the clear mountain sky. For the first time in decades, he felt completely at peace. He found peace within himself and with the choices he had made. Isabella was free. She had found a family that loved her. Peter and Mary had been rewarded for their courage and honesty. And he himself had discovered that it was possible to rebuild a life based on true love, instead of fear and control. The journey that had begun with the desperate cry of a poor boy trying to save a rich girl had transformed into a story of redemption, chosen family, and the victory of love over manipulation. And for the first time in his life, Richard Anderson knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where and who he was meant to be.